Hi, class. We're going to continue our mini lecture by talking about understanding culture. This is taken from chapter 5 of your textbook, and I do recommend you to read the textbook because this is providing you with some additional information, but most of the informations are actually still covered in the textbook. So do please read it first. All right, let's start. Why does it matter for us to talk about culture and to talk about intercultural communication? There are so many reasons why it's important to think about culture as we think about interpersonal communication, especially now that the world is, getting much closer. It feels like a global village, right? So we are trying to adjust to this idea of the global workplace. And so, in many cases, at a lot of your workplace, you're going to meet a lot of people from different cultures and you're going to communicate with them. So, this is why it matters to talk about intercultural communication. We're also trying to adapt to domestic workforce, right? Um, as the society becoming much more diverse, so we understand the importance of, even when we're not working abroad, even though when we're working just here in Colorado or here in the United States, it's almost impossible not to meet with or work together with people who are coming from different culture. Also, there are so many research or studies that talk about how engaging in creative multicultural problem solving is actually so much better than just having the same people from the same background trying to solve a problem. We also do this or learn about culture because we're trying to foster global and intrapersonal peace, right? So I do want to encourage you to think about, what do you think are the other reasons for us to learn about culture, and why does intercultural communication matter? Okay. So now let's talk about the four building blocks when we're talking about intercultural communication. So we have to tackle these four building blocks in order to understand how to become a better intercultural communicator. So first, we're going to talk about culture. Then we're going to talk about communication. We're also going to talk about context as well as power. All right. So building block one, culture. If you're thinking about American culture, right? So how are you going to rank order the following in terms of their importance in defining American culture? If we take a look at hamburger, pizza, taco, movies, apple pie, baseball, hot dogs, milkshakes, big cars, what do you think are the top three American culture products? We understand that, for instance, pizza is not originally from the United States. It's originally from Italy. We understand that taco is not originally from the United States. And so, what are actually American culture? Or what is American culture? And what are the products or the elements that we perceive as American, right? The truth is, everything actually is a mix of different culture here. So when we think about this idea of American culture, it's hard to just pinpoint to just one thing. The truth is, what we considered as American culture has origins from other cultures. So when we're thinking about this idea of culture, is it food? Is it cars? Is it clothes that we wear? Is it the language that we speak? So what is culture? Culture is a learned meaning systems that consists of patterns of traditions, beliefs, values, norms, meanings, and symbols that are passed on from one generation to the next and are shared to varying degrees by interacting members of a community. And this does sound like a catch-all phrase because it seems like We cannot escape culture. Everything is culture. So, to break it down, let's talk about how do we understand culture, right? So the first one is that we understand culture is learned. Culture is the unique way we learn to eat, to sleep, and to seek shelters because we are, we can say we are Canadian, we are Japanese, we are Korean, we are American. So, for instance, in the United States, we tend to eat with our fork and with our knife. Whereas maybe in Japan, we eat with our chopsticks. And in Thailand, we eat with our fork and spoon. So the way we eat is actually something that we learn, something that we understand, that was taught to us by our parents, and we pass it on to our children. Even the way we sleep. Here we sleep on a mattress with pillows. In other countries, in other cultures, they like to sleep on, for instance, a tatami, on a bamboo mat, and not on a mattress. And the shape of our house is going to be different from one culture to another. It depends on where you live. That geographic location matter into how we build our shelters or our homes. And so this is one way that we know about culture, that culture is learned and we pass on from one generation to the next. So when we move into new cultures, yeah, we learn new cultural patterns. Things that seems normal to us suddenly become so foreign. We have to adjust and we need to, learn about these new cultural patterns. And then the second one is that culture involves perceptions and values. So, what do cultural groups learn and share? First, they share perceptions or ways at looking at the world. Culture can be described as a lens through which we view the world. The process of perception is composed of three phases. There is a selection, an organizations, and an interpretation. And this reminds you of the previous chapters, I'm sure. So, for instance, when we are looking at this American flag, we would be reminded of this idea of freedom, this idea of patriotism, this idea of what is it? Opportunity, land of opportunity. The idea that we are safe when we see that flag. But maybe for people from other cultures, looking at the American flag, may not have the same or evoke the same feeling that we feel when we see it, when we look at it. So we imbue or we assign values to what is it to objects that we think as important, and we have specific perception in looking at that object because of our cultural values. And I want you to think about this when you're watching the series Emily in Paris, because it helps for you to understand how our cultures and our perceptions and our cultural values are actually challenged when we move to a different city, to a different place outside our own culture. And so we have to shift our perception, right? And learn about a new cultural value set. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. That culture involves feelings. Culture is experienced not only as perceptions and values, but also as feelings. And when we are in our own cultural surroundings, we feel a sense of familiarity and a certain level of comfort in the space, behavior, and actions of others. Because we know how others are going to behave, because we understand the language, because we understand how to behave in that space, right? We might characterize the feeling as a kind of embodied ethnocentrism, which is normal. And ethnocentrism is the belief that our own culture is the best one. I know this is not really a good, view, but it is very common for us to be brought up with somebody who has attachment to our own culture and therefore believe that our culture is the best one. The stronger your identification with a particular space or cultural situation, the more difficult it might be to change spaces without experiencing discomfort. Again, you will see this example in Emily in Paris, the series from Netflix, and that is why I'm assigning you to watch the first 3 episodes. The next one is the fact that culture is shared. The idea of culture implies a group of people. You cannot just have a personal culture. Culture has to be shared, and it's actually shared by a group of people. So these cultural patterns of perceptions and beliefs are developed through interactions with different groups of individuals. At home, in the neighborhood, at school, in youth groups, at college, and so on. Culture becomes a group experience because it is shared with people who live in and experience the same social environments, right? You understand that, this is our culture because all of us are doing it the same way. That all of us, for instance, eat with our fork and our knife. That, for instance, here we dress in a specific way, right? um, that we, for instance, have pretty similar, activities that we do during our downtime. So, for instance, at the weekend, what we do, a lot of people in Colorado likes to go hiking, for instance, or maybe you like to go and play video games, for instance. So there is that culture that is shared by the people, and you feel that sense of belonging to that group of people. And then culture is also expressed as behaviors. What is American culture as expressed as behavior? Can you give some example? If you take a look at the drawing here, then you see that when we, in a formal context, when we first meet someone, we would shake their hand, right? And this may not be shared by other cultures. Maybe they would kiss cheeks. Maybe they would bow, for instance. So this is one of the way how culture is expressed as behavior. By the way, it is important to understand that we belong to many different cultural groups and that these groups collectively help determine our perceptions, beliefs, and behavior. If you are familiar with the term intersectionality, it shows that we just not embody one part of culture. We have so many or multiple facets in us that define us and makes us who we are. And I do strongly suggest you to look up the definitions of intersectionality in your textbook. All right, and then the next one, culture is dynamic and heterogeneous. Culture is dynamic or changing and can often be a source of conflict among different groups. Seeing culture as dynamic and heterogeneous opens up new ways of thinking about intercultural communication. After all, the people from a particular culture are not identical, and any culture has many intercultural struggles. For example, when we speak of Chinese culture, we tend to ignore the diversity that resides in that culture. That Chinese culture may refer to the mainland Chinese or to the people from Taiwan or to Chinese diaspora who grew up in other Asian countries such as in Vietnam, in Malaysia, or Singapore. So the label Chinese thus obscures incredible diversity, right? Now, that is a great example, but we can also look inside the United States. For instance, there has been so many changes and shifts within the American community, American society. For instance, think about how if we think about the issue of LGBTQ, we see how it has developed from what used to be considered as a minority and considered as illegal. Now we have considered, for instance, same-sex marriage as legal. And that, shows how our view of gender roles and of our concept of marriage has shifted and is very dynamic from what happened in the 1950s all the way to in the 2021, for instance. The next building block. So first we talk about culture. Now we're talking about the next building block, which is communication. We understand that communication is a symbolic process whereby meaning is shared and negotiated. In other words, communication occurs whenever someone attributes meaning to another words or actions. So let's unpack this definition. We understand that one, communication is symbolic, right? There are symbols that we use to communicate meanings. Think about that American flag, for instance. It's very symbolic. It represents certain ideas, certain values that we assign to it. But other culture may assign a different meaning and different values. And then we also understand that communication is a process involving several components, right? We talk about how, for instance, there is a receiver and there's a sender, there is a message, right? And there's a feedback that's involved. We also understand that communication involves sharing and negotiating meaning, because the meaning that we intend to share with the other person may not be accepted as we intended it. So they may have a different interpretation. And therefore, we understand that communication involves that sharing and negotiation of meanings. We also understand that communication is dynamic. It's never the same. The way you talk to your parents would be different from the way you tell a story to your friends, for instance. Even though it's the same story, you may tell it differently. So it's always dynamic. Communications does not have to be intentional. Sometimes you unintentionally communicate. For instance, when your friend is telling you a story and you don't believe the story, your facial expression is showing that. And that's one of an example of an unintentional communication using nonverbal communication. And the fact that communication is receiver oriented. No matter how you no matter what is your intended meaning when you're saying a message, the receiver or the listener or the person you're talking to has to have the same meaning. Otherwise, you don't have a shared meaning, right? So you constantly try to clarify and make sure that the meaning that you intend to tell that other person is actually received the way you want it. So again, what basically constitute a good communication is when the other person actually understand what you're saying. So that's why it says receiver oriented. The building block 3 is context. It's the physical, social, or virtual situation in which communication occurs. For example, communication may occur in a classroom, a bar, a church, or online, and people communicate differently depending on the context, right? So you can think of some examples, I'm sure. Like, for instance, the way you talk to your teacher in a classroom would definitely be different if you're talking to someone else in a bar, for instance. So that's what context means, and that's why it's so important. Now, building block 4 is rather elusive, but it's always there in whatever context, in whatever communication. So power is always present when we communicate with each other, although it is not always obvious. We often think of communication between individuals as being between equals, but that is rarely the case, right? In every society, a social hierarchy exists that gives some groups more power and privilege than others. So, for instance, even when you thought that you're equal with with the person you're talking to, but maybe in that context, one person has more power. For instance, you are planning on traveling to a different state. And in that instance, you're trying to ask your friend to give you a ride to the airport. In that example, you understand that you don't have as much power as your friend because you're the one who's asking for help. And that friend is the one who's going to give you the help, right? So here, even though you know that when it comes to social standing, you both are equal, You both are students, for instance, you work in the same place, you have same positions, but in that instance, somebody has more power. Okay, I hope that example makes sense. Those in power, consciously or unconsciously, create and maintain communication systems that reflect, reinforce, and promote their own ways of thinking and communicating. Yeah. So there are two types of group-related power. More permanent in nature and involves membership in involuntary groups based on age, ethnicity, gender, physical ability, race, and sexual orientation. So, for instance, if you are born as a male, as a Caucasian, and you are good looking, for instance, and you're physically able in this society, you would be the one who hold more power than if you were born as a female, from the racial minority, and if you are disabled and if you are younger in age, maybe. So then we understand that you tend to have less power. Now, the second one is the more changeable and involve memberships in voluntary groups based on educational background, geographic location, marital status, and socioeconomic background. So we understand that the first one is harder to change. The second one is somewhat easier to change. If you don't have as much education, you can always go back to school and have more education. If you are, for instance, grew up in a rural area, if you want to change, you can always move to the city. If you used to be single, if you want to change that, you can get married, right? So this is what I meant by a more changeable and involve membership in voluntary groups. Now, let's talk about the barriers to intercultural communication. Let me take a drink, a 3 seconds break. So when we're talking about the barriers to intercultural communication, there are one, two, three, and four. Basically, the way we view or the way our behavior can create these barriers to intercultural communications. So let's talk about the first one, which is the ethnocentrism. We mentioned this one earlier. The belief that one's own cultural group, usually equated with nationality, is superior to all other cultural groups. And I think, Americans have been thought as having this kind of idea of ethnocentrism. But the truth is, every citizens of every nation tend to think that the country that they belong to is the best country in their mind, right? So it is very common because when we basically teach our citizens to have that allegiance, to have that loyalty, and to have that sense of patriotism, then it's that sense that makes us believe that the country that we belong to and the culture that we belong to are the best culture, right? So what I want you to understand is that ethnocentrism can only be, stop, well, at least minimize by thinking that everything is relative. There are no such thing as the best culture, right? There's no such thing as the best nation. There's no such thing as the best group of people. Because the thing is, everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses, and every culture has its own strengths and weaknesses. So to be able to understand that every culture, every nation, every country has their own strengths and weaknesses will make us think less like an ethnocentrist and more towards a flexible intercultural communicator. Another way that can be a barrier is this idea of stereotypes, which are widely held beliefs about a group of people and are a form of generalization. And we know that when we stereotype others, we tend to hold on to our view and we tend to believe that our views are the is the correct one. So the more you're exposed to people from different cultures, to people from who speak different languages, then the more your world is going to be open up, because you are going to actually face the stereotypes that you create in your own mind, and to be able to question whether that stereotypes is valid or not, right? The next one is prejudice, which is negative attitudes toward a cultural group based on little or no experience. Whereas stereotype tells us what a group is like, prejudice tells us how we are likely to feel about the group. So the word prejudice always starts with like prejudgment, right? So you make a judgment about how you feel about a certain group of people without knowing them first, right? And so it's definitely something that you need to, or we need to question, because most of the time when we make prejudgment before we know someone, it's gonna not be true. So we need to make sure that we get to know them before we make our own judgment. The next one is discrimination, which is the behavior that results from stereotyping or prejudice. We're talking about overt actions to exclude, avoid, or distance oneself from other groups. Discrimination may be based on racism or any other isms. One way of thinking about discrimination is that power plus prejudice equal isms. Yeah. Um, all right, I think that's all for today. I'm going to actually set up the board discussions and ask some questions based on the topic that we have discussed right now, as well as the Emily in Paris series that I asked you to watch. Thanks, everyone.